Greetings and welcome to the CCOF Foundation Small Farm Food Safety Questions Demystified webinar. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Today's webinar will provide answers to common questions and correct misconceptions related to food safety for small and mid-sized farms. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture and produced in collaboration with the Western Regional Center to Enhance Food Safety. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Also note, this webinar is not providing legal advice. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. My name is Megan Donovan. I'll be your host today. I'm a program specialist at the CCOF Foundation. The CCOF Foundation advances organic agriculture for a healthy world through education and hardship grants, technical assistance, and consumer education. My colleague Jacob Guth will also be online today. Jacob is CCOF's Director of Food Safety. Prior to his current role, he worked in CCOF's Organic Certification Department for many years, and he'll be online today to answer questions related to the intersection of food safety and organic. Before we get started today, I wanted to let you know how you can participate in today's web event. We're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar attendee interface, which is made up of two parts. The viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything the presenter will share on their screen, and the control panel on the right. Within that control panel is how you can participate, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. By clicking on the orange arrow, you can open and close the control panel. From the View menu, you can also set the control panel not to auto-hide when inactive if you prefer to always keep it open. The audio pane provides audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. If you prefer, you can join audio via telephone by selecting phone call, and the dial-in information will be displayed. During the presentation, you can send questions to our webinar staff through the questions pane. Simply type your question and click send. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive an email with a link to view a recording of today's event along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. And we actually don't have a PDF of the PowerPoint slides today, but we will send them out so that people can look at them. So we wanted you to test out the questions pane. Let us know where you're calling in from today and what crops you grow. And we'll loop back around to that information at the end of the webinar. And I also wanted to note we have a nice crowd in the webinar today. We're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as we can. But if we don't get to your specific question, please follow up with us afterward and we will get back to you. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Kaylee Feiereisel serves as CAFF and the Farmers Guild Senior Manager for Farmer Services. She provides food safety technical assistance to farmers as they further develop their practices to meet new requirements. In addition to her background in organic farming, Kaylee studied food safety, local food systems, and food and agriculture policy while completing her graduate degree in public health nutrition from the University of California, Berkeley. So Kaylee, thank you so much for joining us again this afternoon, and I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan, for walking us through all of those important details. So today, CAFF and CCOF are pleased to be providing a webinar that is a little different than the ones we've done in the past for small farmers, small and medium farmers on food safety. Rather than really walking through a big concept or all the different steps related to a food safety regulation. Today we're going to kind of do more of FAQs that touch on different parts of it, but it's going to be this compilation of what over the years we've seen a lot of similar questions on, and hopefully that will be helpful to folks that might have some kind of a handful of questions on random parts to the food safety regulation and the Federal Food Safety Modernization Act. So hopefully we touch on some of your FAQs you might have in your head about this topic. And then, as Megan said, there will be plenty of time to add your questions to the question box on the side, and we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. So just to a preface, I always do this on food safety webinars, that inevitably there's so much information, so please don't panic and try and stay with us on the presentation. You'll have, Megan, as she mentioned, we'll have the PDF of these slides. We'll go out in the email to everybody after this. And then there's lots of resources that we'll mention within the presentation. Okay, so just to lay the foundation here, when we talk about food contamination on a farm and farm level, like on-farm food safety, what we're talking about is how food gets contaminated is really in three main buckets. So the first way food can get contaminated out on the farm is by physical contamination. And that can be because a screw falls off of a piece of equipment and lands in a head of lettuce, or there's like a part of a tool that falls off, something like that. It's usually visible and you can see it and you can remove it, and most, if not all, of the risk has been removed. So physical contamination is one type of way food gets contaminated. The second way is chemical contamination, and that can be from improper fertilizer, sanitizer, herbicide, pesticide, or fungicide use, and or if you have equipment lubricant or oil that is leaking out of equipment and gets onto food, that would be chemical contamination. And then the third way that food on the farm can get contaminated is through biological or microbial contamination. And this is done through viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi that we can't see with our, the naked eye, but that get onto the surface of a melon or lettuce and are really difficult to remove. And usually we're not cooking produce, and so those cells of bacteria or whatever it might be on the food are consumed by us and then make humans sick. And that's what leads to foodborne illness outbreaks, or when 2 or more people get sick from some food they ate, and that food having some contamination, some biological contamination on it of some kind. The Federal Food Safety Modernization Act law is entirely, or vast majority of it is focused on biological or microbial contamination. So that is what the rest of this presentation is going to be focused on when we're talking about contamination on the farm. And that's what the law and what our federal and state policies are focused on. Okay, so under FSMA and the Federal Food Safety Law, there are 3 main categories for farms. Some farms are considered fully exempt, some farms are considered qualified exempt or partially exempt, and some farms are considered fully covered. I'm not going to explain these 3 farm categories in depth today. I'm going to go over a little review of them in the next few slides, but there's a number of past CCOF and CAFF webinars that cover this topic. If you, after today, it's still not clear to you, which it might be the case because this is a lot of detailed information, I would recommend that you go and rewatch or watch one of those webinars in the past. And then also, once we get to the FAQ section of the webinar where I'm reading a question and then providing the answer, I'll repeat this again, but those questions and the answers that are given for those questions are framed for farms that need to be in full compliance with the law or fully covered farms. So some of those might have a different answer if a farm is qualified exempt or partially exempt from the law, but we're just giving the answers at the full compliance level. And if people have follow-up questions on that as we go later, please feel free to add those to the question box. Okay, so to do a little recap, if you're not sure whether your farm, what category under FSMA your farm fits into, for farms to be fully exempt, a farm would be growing produce that is only for personal or on-farm consumption, and or that produce that is grown is on the FDA rarely consumed raw list, and or that produce goes through a kill step. And a kill step is referring to pasteurization, fermentation, like very high alkalinity or acidity. So a kill step would be growing raw tomatoes that then get pasteurized and put in and made into canned tomatoes, or raw peaches that get canned into, peaches that are in a jar. So those are different kill steps. So those three top bullet points are different ways and mixtures of combinations that a farm could be considered fully exempt. Or if the farm has total annual gross produce sales of less than 25,000, the farm is considered too small by the federal law and is fully exempt from the law. So important note that that's not all the sales from your farm. So that's gross produce sales. So if you're a farm that is growing lettuce and tomatoes and carrots and other produce for a little farm stand, and you only have $10,000 in sales from that a year, but then you have $50,000 in meat sales because you also have pastured poultry, then that pastured poultry is not produce sales. It's that's a different type. That's food sales, right? That's in the big bucket of all the food sales for the farm. But so you in that scenario would just look at your produce sales for that business is less than 25,000. And there's a lot more detail we're going to go here through a little bit more on the next slide. So what are the crops on this raw list? Well, there's some crops that you would think would be there, like eggplant and potatoes, and then there's some crops that might be surprising to some folks around the country that are on that list, and those examples are figs, and then beet greens and beetroot. The full FDA rarely consumed raw list is on this slide here, and there's the link to the FDA webpage on the bottom where this is listed. And I know this might not seem intuitive for folks on why some things are on here and why some things aren't, but this is based off of a national public health survey every year that happens with a couple thousand Americans on what their health status is, and part of that includes a 24 or 48-hour recall of all the things you've eaten in the last 24 or 48 hours, and based off of that data, they populated this list. So they might not have had enough of a sample size of some foods to be able to have enough validity to put it on this list. And there's a lot more behind that, but for right now, this is the rarely consumed as raw list. And if you're growing, what's an example on here? If you're growing pumpkins and you grow, 100 acres of pumpkins and you sell $1 million worth of pumpkins, it doesn't matter how many acres or how many dollars in sales you have. If you are only growing crops on this raw list, you would be exempt, or your farm would be exempt. Okay, and then one other element that I need to mention with this category is that $25,000 threshold for produce sales, that is based on 2011 dollars, because 2011 was when the Food Safety Modernization Act was passed in Congress. So the law has farmers adjust your financial threshold to be equivalent to 2011 dollars. So what you have to do if you're going to claim this way to get the exemption is that you'll have to take the last 3 years of sales, so from your 2018 sales, your 2017 sales, and your 2016 sales for your farm, average them together, and then compare them to this average 3-year value, that 27,528. And if you're below that for your produce sales, your farm would be considered fully exempt. And again, I have the link on this slide to the FDA page. Hopefully they add the 2019 number not too long after we get into January 2020. Okay, so that was a quick quick overview of the different criteria farms need to meet if they are going to be in the fully exempt category under FSMA. Now we're going to talk about the criteria for farms that meet the qualified exempt category. So 2 conditions must be met for a farm to be considered qualified exempt under FSMA. The first is that that farm has to have less than $500,000 in annual gross food sales. So that's all food sales. That includes any crops you grow for animal feed, any crops that you grow that are dairy or meat or any other types of human food beyond just produce. So if those, if you have meat and dairy and soybeans under your same business name and entity as your produce sales, you have to include them in that $500,000 when you're looking to see if you're under or over this threshold. So that's the first point. And the second point is that you have to sell the majority of your food directly to customers, or what the law calls qualified end users. So directly to customers could be directly to people at a farmer's market, directly to people at a farm stand, or directly to one restaurant, or directly to one grocery store. And all of those must be within the same state or 275 miles from the farm. So you basically can't be dropping off strawberries at a distributor and having them take those, or a wholesaler and having them, ship those to other places. If you're selling it directly to people at a farm stand, farmer's market, through a community supported agriculture program, those count as sales directly to customers. So if a farm has $400,000 in annual gross food sales, and this farm grows produce, all produce, and they sell $300,000 through their CSA each year, and then they sell $100,000 to a distributor that ships it around to other places, their farm would be considered qualified exempt because they are under the $500,000 threshold, and they sell the majority of the food, since they sell $300,000, so they sell 75% of their sales directly to people in the CSA, and then the other 25% of their revenue, or $100,000, they sell to a wholesaler. So hopefully that makes sense for folks for how farms meet the qualified exempt criteria. And then again, just like the first category, this financial threshold is adjusted for inflation as well. So this is important to note because that $500,000 threshold is now up above $550,000. So if this is a threshold that applies to your farm and you might be close, it's important to make sure to do the math to see where the farm falls. Okay, and then just to finish up these 3 farm category overview, for farms that are fully subject to the law, or what the law calls fully covered, farms that fall into this category are those that they have over $500,000 in adjusted gross sales. So those are the farms the law considers too big. And no matter where or how those farms sell their produce, they might have $1 million CSA, but it doesn't matter. They don't get the qualified exemption because they have over $500,000 in sales. So those farms will be considered fully subject and need to be in full compliance with the law. The other category, the other way farms fall into this is if they have less than $500,000 in adjusted average gross food sales, but they do not sell at least half of those to qualified end users. So say a farm grows heirloom tomatoes, and they grow and sell $100,000 worth of those tomatoes every year, and they sell 10,000 of those at their farm stand, and then they sell $90,000 worth of sales by taking it to the terminal market or the wholesaler and selling them there. That farm would be fully subject to the whole law because while they're under the $500,000 threshold at $100,000 in sales, they sell 90% to a wholesaler and then only 10% to a qualified end user. So they don't sell more than half to a qualified end user. Okay, That was a brief overview of the 3 categories of farms. So what farms need to do if you're considered fully exempt from the law is, we're not going to talk about that today. It's been talked about on other webinars. And what farms need to do if they are qualified exempt or partially exempt has been reviewed on other webinars. And then what farms need to do if they're fully covered and need to be in full compliance with the law has been reviewed on other webinars, but we will also be touching on different details related to that today and the rest of the questions, FAQs at the rest of this webinar. But now I wanted to take a pause and Megan, let me know if there's any questions related to the 3 different farm categories that we should talk through and answer right now.
Yes, thank you for that overview. And we have had a couple of questions come in, and I just want to say for right now, we're going to focus the questions just on clarifying questions around these compliance categories, and then we'll get on to other FSMA questions later in the presentation. But first, I just wanted to let folks know who's online. We have folks from a bunch of places in California, including Sonoma, Brentwood, Aptos, and Calaveras. And then we also have some folks online from Nevada. And people are growing mixed veggies, mushrooms, fruit, stone fruit, and berries. So kind of a mix of geographic locations and produce. And then, so one question that came in says, I grow organic walnuts and wine grapes. This is my understanding that wine grapes are exempt from FSMA as long as they're fermented into wine. My organic walnuts are subject to FSMA, but the annual revenue is less than $25,000. However, if I include my wine grapes in the annual sales income, it's over $25,000. Am I fully exempt or not? He gets different answers. He or she gets different answers depending on who they talk to. So,
thanks, Megan, for walking through that question. Yeah, that's a scenario that definitely falls into a gray area for FSMA and for farms figuring out where they fall. You're correct that the wine grapes, if they're being fermented, those fall under what's considered inspection discretion at this point, and they're considered going through a kill step, and those are not on the raw list, but they're basically, they meet that because they're going to be fermented, and that's considered a kill step. And then the organic walnuts are tricky. Basically, I have also heard mixed things about this scenario, and before I jump in with what I've heard, I just want to give Jacob a second. I don't know if you have if you've heard for sure one way or the other. I'm curious what you'd say, but also if you don't know, that's fine too.
In terms of lumping both the sales together?
Yes.
I think that would be my instinct of the way I've read, because it's a total food sales. So I've heard people describe that as like milk, grains, and things that do not relate to produce. And so I would imagine the grapes and the wine to be included in total food sales.
Right. So the example, I agree with that. So the example I believe I gave when I was talking earlier in the presentation was with actually now I can't even remember it, but for the $25,000 example. So if you had 10,000 in produce and then you had 40,000 in meat, that would be 50,000 gross revenue for that business, and that 10,000 is under the 25,000. So it's clear when the other categories of food in the business are not produce that farm would not be considered, that farm would meet the full exemption from the law, because the only food that is produce is under 10,000. But in your situation, that doesn't exactly compare apples to apples, because you've got your whole category of sales is considered under produce under the law. So I believe the CDFA inspectors in California, if you are in California, those are the folks that are running FSMA inspections. I believe they would look at your total dollar sales with the wine and the walnuts, and if that was over 25,000, you would need to figure out if you're in the qualified exempt or the fully subject category. But feel free to, my email will be on the end of this. This person, feel free to follow up with me after, and we can talk more in depth about it.
Great, thank you. And then someone wrote in wondering if Chinese dates, also known as jujubes, are considered to be rarely consumed, in the rarely consumed raw category.
Oops, I was on mute there. I was just going back because I don't have the raw list memorized by, so I know regular dates are on there, but jujubes are not. And so if they're not explicitly spelled out on this list, then they are not considered on this, they are not considered on the FDA raw list at this point in time. There's a number of crops, especially certain greens grown by Asian growers, that are always cooked before they are eaten, that I know those crops and some other crops like taro and whatnot are, there's efforts being done to get those added to this or have some sort of FDA announcement about them that they are considered raw as well. But I do not know anything about jujubes, and I think they probably are falling in the zone of need to be asked about. You need to ask the authorities about them and what the deal is with them.
Yeah, I work with some jujube growers, and they are acting as if they are required to comply.
Okay. Great.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks. So I think we're going to continue on with the second half of the presentation, but if any questions come up, feel free to send them in at any time, and we'll loop back around to those at the end of the webinar.
Great, thanks, Megan. Okay, so now we're going to go through 6 different categories of FAQs related to FSMA that we've heard from growers over the years. So first, we're going to start with general FSMA info. So this is a short timeline of how this law came to be. In 2011, President Obama signed it into law, and then it took a number of years for the FDA to write the different sections of the law. There are 7 main, what they call rules or sections of the law that apply to different parts of the supply chain. So this is not just a federal law that is putting food safety requirements at the farm level. They're also putting them on the facilities and the packing houses, on the processing companies, on transportation companies, even on animal food, on any food imported into the US. So it's very widespread and overarching of our entire food system. The 2 main parts of the law or rules that apply to farms is the produce rule or the produce safety rule, which applies at the farm level, and then possibly the preventative controls rule, which applies for some farm level processing or other activities. And then right now we're in this kind of regulation and enforcement, the beginning of it, but also still continuing education and helping farmers and everyone involved in this get up to speed on what they need to do and where their farm falls under this. And then a reminder that the FAQs that we're about to go through, our answers are framed for farms that need to be in full compliance with the law. So one question I often hear is being in compliance with FSMA the same as a third-party audit? And the short answer is no. And here on this table, I have a little bit of some examples of how FSMA and a third-party food safety audit are different. So on the left-hand side here with FSMA, When there's an on-farm inspection or an on-farm visit of some kind, that would be under FSMA considered a mandatory inspection. If you are selected for a FSMA, if your farm is selected for a FSMA inspection, in any state in the U.S., you can't say, oh no, thank you. It's a federally required inspection that they are going to come and do. Whereas with a third-party food safety audit, that annual or sometimes multiple times a year on-farm visit that auditors do is considered a voluntary audit, and it's often market-driven. And you don't have to have an auditor come out on your farm. If you're not doing a third-party food safety audit, there's not going to be an auditor that comes out. They're only going to come if you, as the farm and the farmer, solicit them and reach out and get that scheduled. So that's one way that they're different. Those on-farm visits or inspections under FSMA, the frequency of them is unknown. Whereas if you're getting the on-farm visit under the audit, those are an annual audits, and then oftentimes one or more unannounced audits at other times of the year for on-site visits. Under FSMA, the law, this is a federal law that has requirements for farm practices, the content of FSMA, whereas the content of a third-party food safety audit is industry requirements, and those are often above what FSMA requires. For FSMA, the on-farm visit, the farm will not be paying for that. However, that's different from the third-party food safety audit. For the on-farm visit, when the auditor comes out annually or multiple times a year, the farm is going to be paying that the company that auditor works with for that auditor's time in that visit. And then one last way that they're different is that under FSMA, the produce safety rule compliance is not the same thing as passing a third-party audit. So if your farm was randomly selected for inspection and you passed, you couldn't then use that inspection pass to take the same place of getting a third-party food safety audit. If you do pass a third-party food safety audit, however, that usually prepares the farm well for a FSMA inspection if your farm was selected for a random FSMA inspection. So there's a number of different categories that I could continue on, but for the sake of time, we're going to stop there. And this is just hopefully illustrative for folks that FSMA inspections and the content of FSMA is different than a third-party food safety audit. There's certainly overlap, but there's a number of different ways that they differ. And the first one being that an on-farm visit under FSMA is considered an inspection, whereas an on-farm visit under a third-party food safety audit is considered an audit. So inspections versus audits. And that is where we'll stop for this question. Okay, so the next question we sometimes get are, do sales to food hubs count as sales to qualified end users? So the short answer on this one is it's complicated, but probably not. And it's related to what is the food hub's role in the process, and are they within the same state or 275 miles from the farm? So for example, in the situation below, the food hub buys food from a farm and then resells it to another business. That would definitely not count as sales to a qualified end user, because there is a formal step in the supply chain that happens, and the farm is not selling it directly to the end customer. They're selling it to a business, and then that business is selling it to the end customer. And the second scenario that exists out there in the world is that some food hubs act as a broker of the food, and they just facilitate the transaction, but they never take ownership of the food. And so if that's the scenario that is happening for a farm, it's likely yes, that the sales through that channel would be considered sales to a qualified end user, but you'd want to look into that more, and feel free to reach out if that applies to you. And then the third situation is when the food hub is another farm that buys produce from farms and that they combine with their own to make a CSA box that they sell directly to consumers. And in that scenario, the farm that's selling, say, the carrots to farm B, who's using those carrots in their CSA box, farm A, who sells the carrots, would be able to count whatever dollars they received, for whatever revenue they had for those sales in carrots. They would be able to count those as sales to a qualified end user because of a provision under the law called the Retail Food Establishment, which relates to the fact that that farm is selling directly to customers and fits a certain criteria that I'm not going to get into in depth right now. But if this specific example is something that farmers on the webinar are experiencing, please reach out. Okay, so that's a recap of some of the general FSMA questions we get. Now we're going to go into inspections. So I know there's folks on from Nevada and possibly some other areas, and there's also a good number of folks from California. So first I'm going to answer this question for folks in California, and then I'll add more for other folks. So do I need to schedule a FSMA inspection? The short answer is no. You don't need to, and you can't. So basically, in California, the California Department of Food and Agriculture has a FSMA inspection team, and they are contacting farmers by phone call to schedule an inspection if your farm is randomly selected for one. However, if you have a farm in California, and the second bullet point here, and you have under $500,000 in adjusted gross sales, you can still schedule what's called a on-farm readiness review, or it's basically a practice FSMA inspection. And there's more information on that on the CDFA website, where you can email or call that phone number to schedule one of those practice FSMA inspections or on-farm readiness reviews. And I will say that this is, inviting the inspection team out to your farm, and it's a helpful educational thing to do. But however, you should realize that if they do see any egregious situation or something that is a severe food safety concern, they're required to report that, and you'll have to be prepared to face whatever consequences might happen after that. So it's a good opportunity for farms under 500,000 at this point to do a practice visit inspection if your farm is ready and prepared, but also realize that that don't just do it without getting prepared, and make sure you know what you're doing. And then that's what's happening in California. In other states, it's likely that the State Department of Agriculture in that state is also doing FSMA inspections for your state. And so you would want to do some Googling to figure out who is the department and where are they located, and how are they, what's the contact information of what they're doing. But in no state do people or do farms like turn in a form to try and schedule your FSMA inspection. It doesn't work that way. You just have to wait and be doing the right practices and be doing everything right and keeping the records. And if the random chance that your farm gets selected for an inspection, then you schedule it with them, and then you go through the inspection and show them your different records and practices to show you're in compliance. There's no way to preventatively or fill out or submit anything in advance. Okay, and then this is a question that often farmers are saying more, is that buyers are asking me to be, quote, FSMA compliant. How do I do that? The short answer is you can't. And buyers, farmers, and many people are confused about FSMA. So we were just talking on the last slide about how inspections work. So if your farm was randomly selected for one of those inspections, at the end of it, there's a certain form that the department inspectors would be filling out, and then they give you some sort of record for that. But there's no formal like FSMA public record place where they put the farms that have passed inspections and the farms that haven't passed inspections. There's nothing like that. And farms can't, self-select to get inspected. There's no way to get an inspection if you really want it. You just have to sit and wait, and if you are selected, then you do get an inspection. So the best response I give farmers that are in this situation is that I encourage farmers to talk to your buyer that's asking you to be FSMA compliant and explain what I just explained, and then also let them know that you can provide the certificate that you got from attending the Produce Safety Alliance grower training, which is a FSMA requirement, and that's a certificate provided by an independent third party, and so that's a formal certificate that you can use to show, see, I am actively getting my farm in compliance with the law, and I've done this training. So there's no way that there's no like state by state registry or anything that the buyers can look up and see that you've passed a FSMA inspection. Okay, and then to transition to the water category, and I believe after this section we have a question break if folks have questions. So for water, what is agricultural water? This is an important question because according to FSMA, agricultural water might not be what you think it is. Agricultural water is water used in covered activities on covered produce where water is intended to or likely to contact covered produce or food contact services, including water used in growing activities and in harvesting, packing, and holding activities. So basically, what all of those covered produce is referring to produce that is subject to the law, so anything that's not on that raw list, and then where it's likely to contact that produce in growing activities or harvesting and packing and holding activities. So we have a couple examples now that, let's see here. If I go to the next one, so we're gonna do a poll, an audience poll for engagement with folks of talking through whether or not something is agricultural water. So in this first example, we have an orchard that has micro sprinklers at the base of the rows of the trees, every 6 feet or so down the row, right in line with the trunks of the trees. And is this agricultural water? Let's see, Megan, do I need to?
Yeah, I'll launch the poll now. So you'll see it'll pop up on your screen, and if you just want to answer yes, it is agricultural water, no, it's not, or if you're not sure, that's fine too. Go ahead and click that, and we'll give people a little bit to answer before we close the poll. So it looks like give people 2 more seconds. We're going to close the poll and kind of share the results. So Kaylee, can you kind of see how people answered?
Yes, it looks like we've got 53% of folks thought yes, it's agricultural water, 41% thought no, and 6% thought not sure. So if we could close that poll and we'll go back to the slide. So this is actually not considered agricultural water because it is not water that is, let me go back to the definition here. So it's water that's used in, it's a covered activity like irrigating a crop, and it's on a crop that is considered covered produce, but the water needs to be intended to or likely to contact the covered crop or the food contact surface. So if that water is in a small little micro sprinkler at the base of that tree, and the crop, I don't know exactly what trees these are in this picture, but say they're peaches, and so there's peaches up in that tree, obviously not right now in that picture, but later in the year they would be. So that water at the ground level, and that 6 or 12 inches off the ground where that water is, that is not intended to or likely to contact the covered produce or that peach up in the tree. So that water under the FSMA is not considered agricultural water because it's not likely or supposed to be touching those peaches. And then We have another example here that is overhead water on leafy greens in a field with all sorts of crops out there, different leafy greens. So Megan, I'll let you activate the poll, please.
All right, oops. So let's go back. So I'll launch the second poll. So again, if you want to go in and answer whether you think it is agricultural water or no, it's not, or you're not sure. And we'll give people a little time to respond before we close the poll. So, okay, a couple more seconds if you haven't answered. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll, and then I'll share it.
Great. Awesome job, everyone. Almost everyone thought, yes, that is agricultural water. And then a couple people were unsure, but that's okay. I know this is tricky. So we'll just transition back to the slides. And yes, that water, overhead water on leafy greens would be considered agricultural water because that water is intended and likely to be touching the actual surface of the crop that we eat. So that is important to keep in mind on what is agricultural water as we move forward and we talk about different requirements and questions related to water, because those questions are actually referred to agricultural water. So what is the current timeline for FSMA water compliance? Or what is the current timeline for FSMA agricultural water compliance? Well, for the different farm annual sales categories, there are different dates for when that farm would need to be in compliance with the FSMA water requirements. If the farm is considered large under the law, which is farms that have over $500,000 in sales, those farms have until January 26, 2022 for FSMA water compliance, because there's an extension on that timeline for the water requirements for the law. And then you can see here that this is tiered, so there's one additional year for farms in the next category, and then the farms in the 25,000 to 249,999 have until 2024 January 26th for the FSMA part with the agricultural water section. The rest of the law, farms have these other timeline, this other row or column here for FSMA compliance. So the largest farms already needed to be in compliance, as well as the 250 to 499. And then the upcoming January 27, 2020 for the tier 25,000 to 249,000 is on the horizon for the rest of the FSMA requirements be outside of the water requirements. But only water specifically, the requirements within that, there's these extension timeline. Okay, so if you're not familiar with what are the water requirements under FSMA for a farm that needs to be in full compliance, well, what does FSMA require for well water? The short answer is you need to do a baseline of 4 tests and then 1 a year thereafter. So as the currently, as the water requirements in FSMA are right now, farms must establish a water baseline for each of your wells, and then you do that over 2 to 4 years by taking 4 tests over 2 to 4 years, and then you create this baseline water quality profile. And then once you have that baseline established, the law requires you take at least 1 test a year thereafter. And the water test results for the well water must have 0 generic E. coli per 100 milliliters if you're using that well water for post-harvest water, and it has to have 126 or less generic E. coli if you're using that well water for production water like irrigation and whatnot. But it's likely that a well is going to have 0 generic E. coli because it is. And if it doesn't, frankly, you want to be concerned about that well having been contaminated by something. But the short answer to what does FSMA require for well water is that you'll need to, at this point in time, if the law stays how it's written now, you'll have to do 4 tests over 2 to 4 years to create your baseline, and then 1 a year thereafter. I keep using the phrase as the as the law stands now because there is this re-review of the water requirements happening right now. That's partially why there's a delayed timeline on those, on when people need to be in compliance, because they're re-reviewing the requirements, and there's a chance that the water requirements may change. But at this point in time, this is how the requirements are written and what's required, and until we hear otherwise, this is what farmers should prepare for. Okay, so that was the requirements for using well water, but then what are the water requirements for surface water? And surface water is water that you use from a pond, from an irrigation ditch, from a stream, from a creek, any kind of water that's exposed to the surface. So the short answer for surface water is that you need a baseline of 20 tests, and then you need to take 5 a year thereafter. So similar to well water, for surface water, you need to create a baseline water quality profile, and you do that by taking 20 tests over 2 to 4 years. And then once you have that baseline established, you need to take at least 5 tests a year thereafter. And the water test results for surface water that you're using in production for like irrigation of your crops, you need to make sure those tests have at least 126 or less generic mean of for generic E. coli, and 410 or less on the statistical threshold value. And those numbers are explained in depth in the training that farmers need to go to that have to be in full compliance with the law. And there's a few different resources out there on Excel, free Excel tools from the University of California at Davis, and at Arizona, they have a different tool that helps farmers just plug in your test result, each of your 20 test results, and then it calculates the geometric mean and the statistical threshold value for you. So that don't panic too much about that, those numbers and phrases, that there is tools out there for you to just take the test result, whatever X number of generic E. coli per 100 milliliter sample that the water lab tells you. It might be, your test result might be 10 generic E. coli per 100 milliliter sample. It might be 487 generic E. coli per 100 milliliter sample. And then, you know, if those were your first 2 results, and then you take 18 more to get to 20, and then the formula in the Excel tool does the math to figure out if you're under that 126 and 410. Okay, and then the other important note is that with surface water under FSMA, you cannot use untreated surface water for post-harvest uses. So you can't use irrigation water to be doing any washing of produce, or water used during harvest, or hand washing water, anything like that, unless if it's untreated. Okay, I want to take a pause, Megan. I know we have another questions break coming up, but those are 3 big topics, especially just the water just now. If it makes sense, feel free to interject if there's any questions that we should just talk about now.
Yeah, thanks for pausing. We didn't have any come in yet, so I think we'll just continue going. But again, if people have questions, feel free to write them in, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Megan. I'm just always hesitant after water to move on because, well, we have more water we're going to talk about now, but I know that's a lot what I just talked through. Okay, so now we're going to move to post-harvest. This question is, what types of water on the farm are considered post-harvest water? So FSMA defines post-harvest water as any water you use to irrigate sprouts, water that directly touches produce during and or after harvest, water that directly contacts food contact surfaces. For example, if you're going to spray out your harvest crates that you put the cauliflower in as you harvest, water that is used to make ice that touches produce and or food contact surfaces, and water used for hand washing. So if all those different categories of water are considered post-harvest water under FSMA, and that has stricter requirements for the test results for that water, and it has to be 0 generic E. coli for water you're using in all of those forms. Oh, I got ahead of myself, I forgot. So what are the testing requirements for post-harvest water? So post-harvest water must have 0 or no detectable generic E. coli per 100 milliliter sample based on FSMA requirements. And again, you cannot use untreated surface water in post-harvest. Okay, and then another question that comes up is, do I have to sanitize my post-harvest water? And the short answer is no. And what I mean by sanitize is that there's different products out there that you can either pour into like a dunk tank of water that you use during post-harvest to like dunk heads of lettuce in or something, or there's other ways to use sanitizers that are like injected into the lines of your water lines in your packing house, things like that. So under FSMA, technically, you do not have to use sanitizers in your post-harvest water. However, there are some parts of FSMA that I want to review, and that is this part 112.41, where that part of the law requires water to be safe and of adequate sanitary quality. And then 112.48a requires water to be managed as necessary to maintain its safety. So this is a question that definitely is in the gray area with FSMA, and we're not sure how it's going to be actually addressed in the real world and in inspections. But farmers have to maintain their water to be safe and of adequate sanitary quality. So if you are, filling a dunk tank with water and then not emptying it out and refilling it and adding new water and cleaning and possibly sanitizing the container of that tank out at some sort of frequency throughout a day of harvest and washing all day long, it'd be pretty hard to say that you're keeping that water in that tank safe and of adequate sanitary quality after 8 hours of a lot of crops being moved through there and not, changing that water out once and not having some sort of sanitizer in the water as well. But that doesn't mean there's a few different ways that farmers can meet keeping their water safe and of adequate sanitary quality. And it really depends on the situation of the farm. It depends on what type of equipment you're washing with. It depends on what crops you're washing. It depends on practices you have as far as how often you're changing out water, how often you clean and or sanitize the surfaces of your equipment. So there's lots of details at play here that I won't dive into at this point, but the short answer is FSMA does not require you to use sanitizers in your post-harvest water, but you need to make sure your water stays safe. So you might want to use a sanitizer product in your post-harvest water, and then you might wonder, well, what products can I use that are organically approved? So the short answer is that I know of 24 products that are organically approved. And the way you can do some research on this is that on this link here on this slide, you can download this free sanitizer guide on the Produce Safety Alliance website. And then it's a good Excel file that you can filter it to view only the organically approved and or approved with restrictions products. And then you can determine which of those sanitizer products you're interested in using and actually are labeled for the use that you want to be using them. And then as always, if you decide you're going to use product X based on that research, it's important to make sure to check with your organic certifier before you actually use that new sanitizer, and make sure to have it be added to your materials list and check in with your certifier. Jacob, would you add anything to that?
No, that sounds perfect, actually.
Okay, great. Just wanted to check. So I want folks to know that there is this resource out there, and I know finding products that are organically approved, sanitizers in particular, might be a challenge if you don't know where to look, but here's a great place to start. And then if you do end up looking at that Excel tool, you'll notice that one of the columns on that has the column header that says, is this product labeled to control public health organisms? And so that usually brings up the question of, do I need to use a sanitizer that's labeled to, quote, control public health organisms? And the short answer is no, because the sanitizers that are out there on the market, to achieve that label, they must pass tests with the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, not FDA. But FDA is the federal department that houses FSMA and has the regulation and that law under it. So there's a little bit of that. There's two different federal agencies, and so EPA has a different process and procedure, and basically a lot of the products that are on that Excel sheet, if they have the answer, if it says no, that product is not labeled to control public health organisms on that Excel sheet, it doesn't mean it's a no because that product was tested and it doesn't succeed. It's probably a no because that product hasn't been submitted through the EPA and gone through that part of their testing requirements. So the short answer is, if you find a product that would work and is organically approved and you want to use it, but the column says that it's not labeled to control public health organisms, I would still encourage you to consider using it, especially if that is a sanitizer that's labeled for use in wash water or on a food contact surfaces, and that's how you're going to use it. So a different column on that spreadsheet says that, what is this product labeled for use on? And it'll say, in wash water or on food contact surfaces. So if you're intending to use the product on your equipment at the start of the day before you fill up your dunk tanks, and you want to spray it out with a sanitizer and sanitize it, that's a great practice to have. So you need to make sure you have a product that is labeled for use on food contact surfaces, because that sanitizer is going to contact the surface of that equipment and then be washed away or air dry, whereas it's not going to be a dunk tank that's filled with water and then you pour that product into it. That would be what would need to be considered wash water, labeled to be in wash water. Okay, so that's a little bit about sanitizers. And now we're going to move on to manure use. So the question is, how long do you have to wait to harvest from a field after it is grazed? The short answer under FSMA is that there is no FSMA-defined waiting period after grazing. There's part of FSMA 11283 that says you must assess the relevant areas for potential contamination, and if significant evidence of potential contamination is found, you must decide if produce can be grown safely there. And then FSMA is its own federal regulation, but then we also have the National Organic Program federal regulation. So if you are certified organic, then growers are generally following the 90 or 120-day rule after they graze animals through an area or through a field before they were to harvest from that field. So right now there's FSMA is a little bit unclear about what to do about a field after grazing, but if you're certified organic, then there is more clarity about the 90 or 120-day rule. The next question is, if manure has been sitting in a pile for a year or a long time, is it considered fully composted? And under FSMA, no. So FSMA has specific compost making requirements, and there are two different methods. One is static composting, which maintains an aerobic condition at minimum of 131 degrees for 3 consecutive days, followed by curing. And then the other is turn composting, which is aerobic conditions at a minimum of 131 degrees for 15 consecutive days with a minimum of 5 turnings followed by adequate curing. So you can't just have a pile of raw, dairy cow manure that has been sitting for a year that a neighbor farmer drops off, wants to give you for free and then drops it off, and then you can't just put that on your field and say, oh, well, it was just sitting for a year, it's finished compost. That's not the case. It's not considered finished compost unless it goes through one of these two methods, the static composting and the turn composting, and there's records to document that. So that's specific details under FSMA as far as how finished compost is considered finished compost. And then the last category of questions is personnel training. So some farmers say, I contract out my harvesting. Is it my responsibility to have records of employee training? The short answer is yes. So if you're your farm business, the farm or business that owns the crop is responsible for all the employees and or contractors that work on it. So if farms hire labor contractors, you should require those contractors to provide written documentation of the workers' training. And what they should be trained on depends on what kind of tasks they're going to be doing. So if they're only going to say they're like an irrigation crew or they're a weeding crew, they're going to have different training topics than if they're a crew that is harvesting. And to specifically go through that a little bit more, this question is, my employees do all the tasks on my farm, from harvest, irrigation, cultivation, all the different tasks. What do they need to be trained on? So under FSMA, the short answer is 6 different topics. And those training topics need to include principles of food hygiene and food safety, recognizing symptoms of foodborne illness and the importance of personal hygiene for employees and visitors. Third, how to recognize risk before and during harvest. Fourth, to never harvest produce with visible feces on it. Fifth, to never harvest dropped covered produce. And sixth, to only use clean packing and harvest containers. For number 5 there, what is dropped covered produce? Drop covered produce is produce that is not supposed to be on the ground, doesn't grow on the ground, is not supposed to be on the ground, but falls to the ground, and then you wouldn't, under FSMA, you're not allowed to harvest that. So for example, wind fell apples that were up on the tree and then blown down, you cannot, under FSMA, harvest the dropped apples on the ground. There's a specific FDA fact sheet that goes into this in more depth. If anyone has more questions about this, I can share that with you, or you can Google and find that. Okay, and then another question is, are composting and pit toilets allowed under FSMA? So the short answer is maybe, and that's because toilets must meet 112.129 requirements of the law. So the first thing is the toilet must dispose of sewage through adequate means. Secondly, it must maintain sewage systems in a manner that prevents contamination of covered produce, food contact surfaces, agricultural water, and areas used for covered activities. Third, you need to manage and dispose of leakages or spills that prevent contamination. And fourth, you need to check functioning of toilet after a significant natural event like a flood or an earthquake. So there was a specific question related to composting and pit toilets that was submitted to the FDA's Technical Assistance Network, or TAN, where you can submit questions on different FSMA topics. And their response was basically these bullets of citing the law and how these parts of the law are in there. And so they didn't explicitly say, no, they're not allowed, and they didn't explicitly say, yes, they are. They just said if the situation would meet these requirements, then that would be meeting the law. Okay, so that was a hodgepodge of different FAQs on FSMA and different topics and going through those. And now I wanted to take another moment to pause and see if anybody on the webinar has any questions on any of those different categories or topics.
Great. Yeah, thank you for going over all of those frequently asked questions. I know we've gotten a number of those here at CCOF as well. And someone did write in asking if you could talk about what growers should do if their irrigation water is not meeting FSMA standards. You know, are there water treatment options or mechanisms to bring the water quality up to compliance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to assume that they're using surface water for irrigation. If they are, then they can do a number of different things. The first thing would be to inspect their irrigation system, the parts of it that can see above ground, to just make sure that there's no unusual thing happening that is causing the test results to be too high. I have heard of a situation where a grower unexpectedly found some deer carcasses in his reservoir or pond on his property that some hunters in the area had left there, and he wasn't aware of that until he saw some really high water test results, and then his walkthrough or walk around his system led him to discover that. So first step is always to walk your system and make sure there's nothing unusual happening. And then the second step would be to, under FSMA for production water, there's something called the microbial die-off. And depending upon what your test results are for your geometric mean and your statistical threshold, that same Excel tool that I mentioned it's also built into the calculations to tell you if you need to wait a certain number of days after your last irrigation before you harvest, because during that time there's natural die-off of any contamination because of just wind and sun exposure and just natural death. And so some water test results that are too high initially, if you wait 1, 2, 3, or 4 days after the last water before harvest, the numbers go down enough to make it safe to harvest. So that could be an option. And then another option would be treating your irrigation water with some sort of sanitizer or some sort of method like an ozone filter or other methods. So that same Excel sheet I mentioned with the different sanitizer products used during the post-harvest on equipment and things, you can search for sanitizers that you could use in water that you irrigate with. So those are the first things that come to mind. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. We also had someone else write in wondering if there are other food safety laws other than FSMA. And I would say just since we're talking about produce farms, kind of keep it focused on that, noting that there are a lot of other food safety laws for food processing and handling and whatnot.
Yeah, so it's a good question. And yeah, if you're doing any kind of food processing, value-added products in California and in other states, you definitely jump into a whole slew of all sorts of other food safety laws and regulations at the state and federal level. And CAFF has different resources on that. So feel free to reach out or check our website out with that. But just for raw produce on the farm, the main federal food safety requirement or regulation is the Federal Food Safety Modernization Act. And then specifically in California, we do have a state level law that farms need to be practicing good agricultural practices, or GAPs. So that is in play in California, and I'm not aware if other state level laws like that exist in other states, but they may.
Great, thank you. And Jacob, you had something you wanted to add to the conversation?
Oh yeah, just I guess talking about how buyers verify compliance. And so buyers sometimes they're the pack houses, and those packing houses, they fall under the FSMA preventative controls rule, which requires them to have a supplier verification program where they need to verify that all the suppliers that are supplying their packing houses are compliant with the produce rule. And I think buyers try to have their supplier verification programs as well. And instead of them going out to inspect each farm individually and determine whether or not the farm is complying with the produce rule, oftentimes they're relying on the third-party food safety certificate to say, okay, well, it doesn't directly conform to FSMA produce rule, but it does allow them to say that there's a documented thing happening here where the farm is getting into compliance with the produce rule. And then tangentially on that is that the third-party audit standards like the Primus and the Global GAPS and the SQF, those folks have altered their standards since FSMA produce rule came out. So there's tends to be a trend towards alignment between the third-party standards. Like Kaylee mentioned that oftentimes the third-party standards will require more than FSMA, but there were some unique things that FSMA did require that I think a lot of the third-party standards have adjusted their standards to conform to the produce rule as well. So that's what I'm seeing out there in the marketplace, and I figured that was worth sharing.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that might also kind of give a little more background on that question, like, are you FSMA compliant coming from a buyer because they're looking to make sure that they're meeting their food safety requirements through FSMA.
Exactly.
And so we also had someone write in wondering if GAPs are third party, is a GAP a third party compliance audit? And either Kaylee or Jacob, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I can start, and then Jacob, please feel free to add because you have so much experience with audits. But the way I like to explain it, it's really confusing at first because the acronym GAP gets used a lot. So GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practices, and good agricultural practices as a concept are a voluntary set of practices that a farm puts in place to help reduce your food safety risks and help reduce the chance that any of your food gets contaminated, gets microbially contaminated, or physically or chemically contaminated. And these third-party food safety audits are often, GAP is often part of the name of them because you need to be doing these good agricultural practices and a number of different parts of your farm to be able to pass one of these audits. But an audit name like Global GAP might have GAP in the name, and that's because you need to be doing the concepts and the practices that are considered good agricultural practices to have a chance at succeeding at passing that audit. Jacob, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that's perfect. And similarly, the FSMA produce safety rule doesn't necessarily use good agricultural practices or GAPS acronym, within the rule, but what it's codifying is the long-standing conceptual and practices of good agricultural practices, so GAPS down on the farm. So the produce rule is GAPS in law, are GAPS in law.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So it looks like that's all the questions we have for now. Again, if something comes up and you think of something afterwards, both Kaylee had her email up there, and so that's a resource. And Jacob, would you also be open?
Sure, yeah, jacob@ccof.org.
Great, and we'll send that contact information out with the follow-up email as well. So Kaylee, thank you again for a great presentation as usual, kind of presenting super complicated food safety regulations in an understandable and well-paced manner. We always appreciate having you. And Jacob, again, thank you for taking time to be here as well. And with that, we're just going to go over a few additional resources. As Kaylee mentioned, CAFF and the CCOF Foundation put on a number of webinars on food safety that go more into depth about the requirements of FSMA. If you're a small or mid-sized farms, our FSMA basics for small and mid-sized produce farms is a good overview and goes into some of the record-keeping requirements you may have. And we also have a whole series for farms that must fully comply with FSMA, including one that goes into the ag production water requirements in pretty good detail, and also gives some great recommendations on how to take a water sample and some of the more practical side of that. And then these are just some good general food safety resources. And again, we'll be sending out a PDF of the slides so you can have access to these links. We have a bunch of events coming up this winter. In December, there's the Organic Grower Summit in Monterey that's co-hosted by the Organic Produce Network and CCOF, and that's a great place to network with people in person. We'll have a couple webinars in January and December on crop insurance and managing soil irrigation for drought. And then we have the CCOF annual meeting coming up in February in Sacramento. So all those events are listed on our events page. Also, there's been a number of wildfires in California, and we just wanted to let folks know that the CCOF Foundation has the Brickmont Hardship Assistance Fund that provides direct financial assistance to organic producers who suffer losses due to extreme hardship. So if you were impacted by the wildfires or some other natural disaster, or know organic producers who were, please forward this information on to them. And the fall application deadline is coming up soon on November 25th. And thank you again for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to spend an afternoon with you all. Please fill out the evaluation form when it pops up after the webinar. And just a note that the way GoToWebinar does their evaluation forms, it is attached to your name. So it's not anonymous, but we appreciate all types of feedback, including how we can improve. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kaylee.